The American Revolution and the French Revolution took place within a few years of each other. And yet the results of those two things were almost opposite when it came to free speech. The American colonies, they emerged from that revolution, eventually, at least in the long run, with a pretty strong commitment to free speech, both in their documents and in their culture. And yet, after the French Revolution with Napoleon, there was a clamping down on free speech. Napoleon had more authoritarian control over the press at that time, and the population was a little more on board with that style in France. And so I want to go through the history of the Enlightenment and free speech in the Enlightenment with this question in mind. Why such different results from revolutions that were motivated by some of the same values? And those values are the values of the Old Enlightenment. So here we're talking about free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, human rights, universal education, rationality, the scientific method, due process, checks and balances on power. All of these were concepts that were emerging in the Old Enlightenment as these thinkers were trying to renegotiate the social contract. And this is the second in a series I'm doing on the history of free speech from this book, which I'll link to below. Amazing book, beautifully written. And one more question I would like to bring to the table as we go through the history of free speech in the Old Enlightenment is, why did some of these Enlightenment thinkers have an elitist version of free speech that they supported rather than an egalitarian version of free speech? Because it's actually kind of weird that some of the founding fathers, including Washington, Adams, and Hamilton, supported free speech for people in Congress or for the elites, but not for the general populace. Why was that? What could they have been thinking? And of course, I'm definitely more an egalitarian free speech person. That will, I think, come through by the end of the video. But understanding where those people are coming from might strengthen our ability to defend a more egalitarian version of free speech. To set the scene here, the Old Enlightenment took place in Europe and in the American colonies from roughly the mid-1600s to the early 1800s. And here's a list of some of the Old Enlightenment thinkers you might have heard of. These are people who are thinking about the renegotiation of the social contract and these liberal values that they were wrestling with as they were thinking about how might we change the fabric of society. And yet the Enlightenment is actually kind of hard to define, so let me give you a quote here. Historians are not now, nor have they ever been, in agreement about how to define the Enlightenment or its legacy. But if there is one central theme underlying the Enlightenment, it's the emphasis on rationality and demystification at the expense of dogmatic theology and unquestioned tradition. This pushback on dogmatic theology of the time was an act against the power structures and the authorities of the day. And at that time, rationality was one of the ways of counteracting that. Now, of course, because the ideas of the Old Enlightenment got picked up and adopted, and the system has sort of evolved around them, we do live in an age where some of this has manifest in a way where the new power structures kind of assume these old ideas. The whole concept of this channel is that we're living in an age where we might need new ideas, we might need to bolster some of the old ideas, we might need to update some of the old ideas to protect ourselves from power structures of this modern age. And when it comes to free speech throughout history, oftentimes this is a battle over the collective moral frame or the collective mythology of a society, where the battle is between the power structures that want to maintain their authority and the people who want to push back because they experience the negative side effects of the power structure. That's sort of underlying a lot of the history of free speech. Now, I left off my last video on free speech with Martin Luther and the printing press, where the printing press is basically this technology that tipped the scales toward the population who wanted to critique the authorities and away from empowerment of the authorities. So that's sort of how that ended. Now, leading into the Enlightenment, of course, eventually this battle between these groups continues, and eventually the authorities figure out, okay, what are some better ways of censoring? But still during the Enlightenment, there are going to be some of these underground printing presses that are more oriented toward letting anything fly, including things the authorities don't like. Clandestine Dutch printing presses and networks of print diffusion were regarded much like the dark web of the 21st century, a lawless black hole of filth, crime, and sedition that undermined and corrupted the essential foundations of society. He uses the word sedition here, and this is one of the main types of speech that has been absolutely banned throughout history, where sedition is riling people up against their rulers. And of course, sedition can lead to violence. It can lead to really bad things. So that's one of the reasons it's banned. What about the American colonies at this time? What was going on there that sort of fed into this discussion of free speech and discussion of power structures? And of course, people in the colonies are forming their own little mini governments for the first time. That was a big deal with the colonies. And so they were having to wrestle with what kinds of speech do we want to allow in our little community? And let me read you a quote here. Pennsylvania's Act of Freedom of Conscience punished anyone who abused or ridiculed another person for her religion as a disruptor of peace. That is basically an anti-free speech type of legislation where they're trying to legislate against bullying, legislate against something that would perhaps quiet bullying of people for their religion. So you can see this tension here where they're trying to protect freedom of religion, and they recognize that speech can be used to cause people to not speak about their different religion. So they're trying to use the law to push back on the speech that's bullying speech like that, but then it sort of empowers the law and gives power to control speech to a government center. They were wrestling with all of these issues as they were trying to form their little colonial communities. Now, one of the big publications that got people riled up about free speech was Cato's letters. This was in the 1720s, and Cato was in reference to somebody in ancient Rome that I talked about in my last video who was sort of into free speech back then. But one of the big things about Cato's letters is that it created these memes, these phrases that were able to spread and have people talking about free speech in a way that had just really delicious language. Thomas Gordon wrote the now iconic words, "Freedom of speech is the great bulwark of liberty. They prosper and die together. And it is the terror of traitors and oppressors and a barrier against them." Cato's letters also warned against the vague and arbitrary nature of the crime of seditious libel. I already mentioned that sedition is using speech to rile people up against their rulers. Libel, of course, is insulting people or insulting people in writing. And of course, those insults are oftentimes toward the ruling class. So Cato's letters are just pointing out the fact that whoever gets to determine what kind of words and what kind of language are seditious libel, that power to define that can be abused. Another big moment for free speech in the colonies happened with the 1735 court case of Andrew Hamilton, where Andrew Hamilton is going to be the famous lawyer who's doing this court case. And he describes this as being like a Hollywood drama. And I think one of the big roles of this court case was getting people to start talking about free speech, to have strong opinions about in favor of free speech. That was sort of the role of this court case. But how this played out was basically in New York City, you had a governor who was basically a petty tyrant. William Cosby was his name, and the New York Gazette was the local monopolist newspaper that only said good things about this petty tyrant governor. And so it seemed like, wait a second, we want news that's actually critical of the governor who deserves some criticism. And because of that, somebody started up an opposition newspaper, the New York Weekly Journal, which would actually critique the governor and maybe even go a little bit far, maybe even mocking him sometimes and having really harsh criticisms, maybe even allowing people to publish bad things about the governor under the protection of a pseudonym, so they could do it anonymously. They could say these horrible things about Cosby without anybody knowing who they were. And as you might imagine, the New York Weekly Journal would frequently quote from Cato's letters about free speech being the bulwark of liberty. They were trying to protect their turf with their ability to criticize, maybe even in some cases unjustly, this governor. Now, the guy who started the New York Weekly Journal, this opposition newspaper, his name was John Peter Zenger, and he was a poor German immigrant. And Hamilton came in and offered to be his lawyer in defending him. And what happened, of course, was the governor took up a lawsuit against him, suing him for seditious libel. And was that allowed? Yes, it was. Let me give you a quote. "They are allowed to imprison seditious writers for contempt, since the people's representatives were not to be second-guessed for their official actions outside the assembly." And Hamilton, this famous lawyer, came along to defend Zenger, and the court case was just plastered all over the news for a while. People were talking about it. People were developing opinions about it. And one of the arguments that Hamilton made was the argument of truth. It was the fact that the stuff that was published in this opposition paper was true and therefore should be allowed even under the seditious libel law. And truth is still a defense in cases like this up to this day in the United States. So what happened with this court case? And the jury in this case actually decided in Hamilton's favor. Now, this did not change the law. Seditious libel was still illegal after the case, but it did sort of change the public sentiment and what could be upheld in court. Legally, the common law crime of seditious libel stood intact, with no defense of truth. But in practice, the Zenger case was crucial to the creation of a culture of free speech. That was 1735, and this culture of free speech that sort of came on the scene through this court case ended up being really important for the way things evolved moving forward, even leading all the way up through the American Revolution. Now, I want to talk about John Wilkes, partly because it just cracks me up. He was basically a troll of the 1700s, but also because it's relevant for free speech, because you have this discourse going on in Europe and in the colonies, and they're thinking about the limits of free speech, what are the problems with free speech, and at the same time you're doing this, you have people behaving like this. So who was John Wilkes? He was a member of Parliament in England, but he was also engaging in what many would call, or at least Wikipedia calls, radical journalism, which is basically calling people names and starting rumors about people. He said the Prime Minister was sleeping with the King's mother, for example. And let me read you a quote here. When a French official asked him how far press freedom extended in England, he replied, "I cannot tell, but I am trying to know." And Wilkes' behavior on this front left a pretty bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. So David Hume, who was one of these thinkers in the Old Enlightenment, he actually toned down his defense of free speech when he saw this going on, because he was like, wait a second, I see really bad things happening, people being criticized unfairly because of free speech, so maybe I won't defend it quite as much as I did before. And Wilkes was eventually thrown into prison for his speech. He spent 2 years in prison as punishment. And one interesting statistic he gives over this time period is that 17% of the inmates in a particular prison were imprisoned for literary crimes. So it does seem that control over speech is a priority for the people with the power to put people in jail. Now, one of the big things in the Old Enlightenment was the Encyclopedia that they were putting together. And this was published between 1751 and 1772, with some updates and revisions coming after that. But you have a lot of these thinkers in the Old Enlightenment, like Diderot and Rousseau and Voltaire, who are contributing to this encyclopedia that's talking about science and religion and politics and progress. And it's trying to do this in a way that's as neutral as possible. And yet, the encyclopedia's articles were filled with the subtle and not so subtle challenges to the twin authority of the Catholic Church and the French absolute monarchy. And the guys writing this were sometimes victims of the targeting around free speech. For example, Voltaire wrote, "Does a book displease you? Refute it. Does it tire you? read it not. And that was banned as false philosophy. However, these Old Enlightenment thinkers actually did fall victim to this dynamic that we see throughout history that I talked about in my previous video with Martin Luther, where you have people who require free speech to say some things they want to say. They're advocates for free speech, but once they get taken up into seats of power or seats of authority, at that point they turn around and scale back some of their rhetoric around free speech. And this did happen with some of the Enlightenment thinkers, and other of the Enlightenment thinkers wanted free speech for the enlightened or the educated class, but not necessarily free speech for the masses. So that's happening in Europe. But what about the colonies? And the colonies in Europe kind of have this dialogue where writing from one place travels to another, and they're both watching each other. And one of the cases he makes is that the dialogue happening in the colonies at this time became really vitriolic, and people just got used to the harsh sort of style that happens with rigorous debate, and offensive style and sort of hatred that sort of goes back and forth between these groups when you allow a culture of free speech. And he makes an interesting case that John Adams, this is one of the founding fathers, when John Adams was at the end of his life looking back, he attributed the revolution not to the war, but to the period leading up to the war where people got used to debate, to rigorous conversation. What do we mean by the revolution? The war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and a consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775 in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington. And a lot of the ugliness of this debate in the colonies was between groups who supported British rule, the Loyalists, and the people who wanted to throw off British rule. And this debate happened in part through these pamphlets, which are basically just memes that went around on paper, where people would let off steam and just say horrible things about the other group. Pamphlet wars often started out with reason and arguments, but they quickly descended into an 18th century version of flaming, trolling, name-calling, motivated reasoning, and butchering of straw men in chains of pamphlets responding to each other in increasingly shrill language. Now, we're sitting here in the mid-1700s during the Enlightenment, and I want to return briefly to the question we opened this video with, which is, why did the American Revolution and the French Revolution have such different results when it came to free speech? And I do not think this would have been predictable from the perspective of the mid-1700s, because there is so much dialogue traveling back and forth between the continents on this topic. And yet he does have a bit of an answer that's based in the mid-1700s. And one of his answers has to do with the fact that people in the colonies just had more experience with free speech and had gotten used to the vitriolic nature of the dialogue. Is the key to its endurance wording of constitutions or declarations? Or is it a nation's commitment to a culture of free speech and the tolerance of controversies, offensive ideas, and very public disagreement about fundamental values that inevitably arise from this freedom? A possible answer to why free speech fared so differently in France versus America could be that in 1789, the French had comparatively little experience with a wide and uninhibited public sphere outside more abstract philosophical circles. Now, we tend to think of the revolutionaries or the patriots as being morally righteous, upstanding people with good values that they're just trying to implement in the world. But they did actually use speech strategically, including in some ways that not everybody would consider to be moral. The patriots even resorted to spreading some genuine fake news. And sometimes that fake news actually had real-world consequences that were in the patriots' favor. So, for example, you might imagine all of these colonies they had their own mini governments where they're trying to pass different types of legislation, and that legislation can either be more pro-British rule or a little bit more revolutionary or more on the patriot side. And one thing they did was to spread false rumors that other colony had passed some more radical pro-patriot legislation. And of course, that means that when other states hear, oh, Virginia passed that legislation, it makes them way more likely to pass the legislation themselves. And this is a very powerful bandwagon effect. So even though it was false that Virginia actually passed it, it had a real effect of causing this legislation to be passed in other colonies. And they could, of course, just say, whoops, we didn't know that was false information. Too bad. I guess the legislation's already passed. We got our way. And so they're using lies to affect the real world. They're not always honest. Another example he talks about relates to how they got the Stamp Act repealed. And of course, the Stamp Act was the way the British rule was taxing the colonists to finance the soldiers that they would have to quarter in their homes and all of that. The colonists were able to get Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act with a combination of eloquent commentary, fake news, propaganda, symbolic speech, and naked intimidation. So we do have cases back then of people using their free speech rights to shut down the speech of others through intimidation. All of this led to the American Revolution. You have 1776, the Declaration of Independence. In 1781, you have the Articles of Confederation ratified, and this was the temporary constitution. While the Articles of Confederation had guaranteed freedom of speech and debate, this only applied to members of Congress. So yeah, the founding fathers who were writing the Articles of Confederation, they did support a more elitist version of free speech, where free speech was for the educated, the Congress people, the leaders. Free speech was not a right of the common people at that time. The war was won in 1783, 1784. In 1788, the Constitution was passed, and yet there was nothing in it about free speech. Now, as the founding fathers were constructing the Constitution, they were studying ancient Rome and ancient Greece because that's where a lot of the thought around democracy and governance came from. And as I mentioned in my other video, which I'll link to below, the Greek model was more of an egalitarian version of free speech. The Roman model was more of an elitist version of free speech. And the founding fathers were way more looking to Rome than to Greece and how they were thinking about structuring the situation in the United States. It was not until the Bill of Rights in 1791 that we actually get mention of free speech in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And so that seems like a pretty solid victory for freedom of speech. And yet it was only a few years later, in 1798, that we get the first Sedition Act. What was this Sedition Act? Well, let's look at this. The Sedition Act made it illegal for people to write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States, either the Congress of the United States or the President of the United States, with the intent to defame or to bring them into contempt or disrepute, or to excite against them the hatred of the good people of the United States. How did that happen? How did legislation like that get passed in the United States? And to understand this, there were these two factions that were warring at the time, where one of them was the Anti-Federalists, who supported more of an egalitarian version of free speech for everyone. The other group was the Federalists, and of course there's lots of other differences between these groups, but the Federalists generally supported a more elitist version of free speech. And you can imagine which of those two groups wrote that legislation. Now, I should say that the Federalists includes a lot of people who are our founding fathers. This includes Alexander Hamilton. The Federalist Papers are still considered a founding document by many people. So it's not like one group's good and the other group's bad. It's a really complicated situation. Oh, and George Washington and John Adams were also Federalists. So if this position that they would be elitist in their free speech views, if that sounds weird to you, I'm going to return to that after we talk about the French Revolution, because that's going to explain some of it. But of course, the Sedition Act was the brainchild of the Federalists in this case. And one interesting thing that's noted in the way that's written is you note in the list of people you cannot critique, it does not protect the vice president. And the reason for that was the vice president at the time was Thomas Jefferson, who was an anti-federalist, whereas the president was a federalist. And of course, this was the time when the president and vice president were both candidates who ran against each other, and they both went into those seats. They had not yet linked the president and vice president at that time. So the legislation needed to leave room to critique the vice president, Thomas Jefferson, of course. The Sedition Act was also set to expire at the end of that particular administration, so that if we happen to get an anti-federalist person into the office of president, the Sedition Act would not be enforced at that point by that anti-federalist president. In other words, Federalists were not willing to become the potential targets rather than the enforcers of the Sedition Act should they lose political power. And of course, the Sedition Act backfired on the Federalists, because once there was an election and people could elect somebody, they elected against the Federalists. They elected an anti-Federalist president, and the Sedition Act was permanently put to rest. The Sedition Act did allow a defense for the truth, and that is, of course, hearkening back to the Andrew Hamilton case, where there was the governor that we talked about just earlier. Now, the French Revolution went down really differently than the American Revolution. And this took place between 1789 and 1799. There was this group of people, this group of revolutionaries that got some power. This was the National Convention that set themselves up as the government to push out the old regime and to implement revolutionary principles, revolutionary ideas, and human rights and things like that. That was their intention, 1789. And they put together this document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And let me read you a few things from that document as it relates to free speech. The free communication of thoughts and opinions is one of the most precious of the rights of man. Every citizen may therefore speak, write, and print freely if he accepts his own responsibility for any of the abuse of this liberty in the cases set by the law. Now, the French Revolution was long and complicated, and I'm really just going to focus on the parts of it that relate to free speech. But more or less, the revolutionary class that gained power during this time and had all these battles between themselves, they ended up using the guillotine a lot. And of course, that started out just using the guillotine to kill the old elites, the old regime, but they also started then to use the guillotine to kill people who said things against them, to kill their adversaries. And one telling example that he goes into in the book relates to a woman called de Gouges, who objected to some of these guillotine killing of the old elites. And here's what she said. She called for a stop to assassinations and the suffering for merely holding opposing views. And for saying that, she was put on trial, rushed through the trial, and guillotined herself. So that gives you a sense for the kind of thing that was going on during the French Revolution. And by 1794, things had kind of escalated such that the Great Terror took place. And the Great Terror was a situation where there was a law that went into place to very harshly persecute anyone who went against this revolutionary new government. The infamous Law of 22 Prairial, also known as the Law of the Great Terror, condemned to death enemies of the people who were found guilty of disparaging the National Convention and the Republican government, spreading false news, misleading public opinion, corrupting the public conscience. In other words, any dissent, real or perceived, was enough to send you to the guillotine. And a lot of people were killed by this revolutionary regime that originally supported free speech, had that as a part of its founding documents, but then ended up sort of flipping the script and persecuting people who critiqued them. You could see how the power dynamic in this situation would make it pretty confusing. Should you support free speech? Does that mean you're supporting this regime that is killing people for their speech who critique the regime? There's a lot of confusing things going on. And in the middle of all this, France got into a war with Austria and Prussia. And the author points out that when that happens, when a country's national security is threatened, people are more on board with restrictions on free speech in order to gain unity among the population. The French Revolution ended in 1799 when Napoleon came in and established his autocracy. And he did that with essentially draconian control over the press. He shut down 60 newspapers so that there were only 13 newspapers left. And he maintained control over those newspapers through surveillance and through strong limits on what they could say, strong influence on what came out through those papers. So we really do have opposite scenarios when we look at the French Revolution versus the American Revolution. America came out with pretty strong commitment to free speech, both in its constitution and in its culture, whereas in France, both the population was more on board with control over speech, wanting that chaos of the French Revolution to end, and also Napoleon Bonaparte and his government were very officially against free speech. So there is a pretty strong contrast. So let's return again to the colonies and this weird thing that happened with the Sedition Act, where we have these founding fathers who were Federalists, that is, Adams, Washington, and Hamilton. These people actually passed legislation to limit people's ability to critique their government. What the heck was going on with that? And if we want to try to understand the Federalists' point of view, which was an elitist free speech point of view, like free speech for the elites, but not for the general populace, they were looking at France and they were saying, wait a second, what happened in France was terrible. They're basically interpreting that as people getting riled up and resentful, and the resentful people gained power and then used that power to guillotine everybody they didn't like in unfair ways. So they're seeing that and they're like, wait a second, we don't want that to happen here. And at the same time, they had this brand new government with representatives who were elected by the population in the United States. And they feared that if there was too harsh a critique floating around the population, then the population could rile up against this brand new, possibly fragile representative democracy that they were trying to implement. Now, I would like to give a steelman argument for why some of these Old Enlightenment thinkers supported that elitist version of free speech. And a steelman argument is basically you come up with the best possible argument you can think of for why someone with the opposing view might hold it. And so I'm going to do that for these people, and then I'm going to give a counter argument against that. And both of these are going to relate to contempt, which I think is one of the key concepts to understand, to really understand governance. Where contempt, the way I define it, it's long-standing negative thoughts or feelings about a group or person being morally inferior, intellectually inferior, or beneath consideration. And if you imagine like a 20-person friend group where there's these two people who everybody kind of knows have contempt for each other, the way that oftentimes manifests is in these subtle actions, like making a subtle jibe that's kind of underhanded and difficult to counteract, but you're like, oh yeah, that person's slipping that fact into the conversation, or accidentally leaving them off an email that's where the friend group's thinking about going somewhere. It just manifests subtly this sort of contempt for that person. And the reason this matters so much for governance is a lot of times when we think about the debate over these things, it's not really about the issue. It's not about that tax or that legislation. The fear and the drive behind it is oftentimes more about a fear of somebody gaining power and having all of the levers of government's power to wield. And if that person has contempt for a group or a population, that population can legitimately fear what might come, even if they don't know exactly how that would manifest. It's just somebody in power who holds me in contempt has the power to act on that contempt in ways that may be subconscious or maybe not necessarily intentional. It's just an acting out of that hatred. That is a legitimate fear when you're thinking about governance. Now, another thing about contempt is that it's contagious. And that contagion often happens through speech, where people talk and the discourse develops this emotional aspect to it that spreads from person to person to person, and suddenly that anger and frustration that people may experience in their everyday lives for reasons they haven't figured out, but it's frustrating, that gets channeled in a particular direction toward a particular population. And that can be really powerful when you channel people's frustration toward a group to hold in contempt. And I think when I try to understand why might somebody support an elitist version of free speech, I think the fear comes from this notion that free speech among the general populace could rile up this contempt in a way that creates an energy that will overturn a legitimate government and use that newly gained power in a way where their own contempt, the revolutionaries who do that, will be enacted as it seemed like it might have happened in the French Revolution. I suspect that that is one of the fears that's driving support for an elitist version of free speech. And I do think it is a legitimate thing to fear that that could happen, because it has happened throughout history. But here's my counter-argument to that. And to understand this, we need to return to the definition of contempt and notice that among these three things that characterize your attitude towards another group or person, two of these are hot types of contempt, and the third is a cold type of contempt. If you're viewing somebody actively as being morally or intellectually inferior, that's hot, it's riled up, it's got substance to it. But if you're viewing another group or population as being beneath consideration, that's actually kind of a cold contempt. It's just dismissive, it's just, it's not worth thinking about those people. Just let them do their thing. We're not going to engage with them. And hot and cold contempt appear in different ratios at the top of the power pyramid versus the bottom of the power pyramid. Because at the top of the power pyramid, you don't have to engage with those people that you dislike. You can just dismiss them and not really think more about it. You can just not think about their issues because you have the power to do that. Whereas if you're somebody who's experiencing the negative side effects of people in power, and that's a daily reality for you, it's hard not to feel that strongly. Like you develop a contempt that actually does have hot substance to it. So cold contempt is more common at the top of the power pyramid. And I suspect that the intuition people might have who support a more elitist version of free speech is that contempt is bigger among the general populace than among the elites. And that the elites have less contempt, or they're less likely to have contempt. Of course, the elites are more likely to be educated, more likely to be socialized in certain ways. But I think that's profoundly misguided, because the cold type of contempt is really powerful in terms of driving negative things going on in our system from positions of power. I also think free speech among the elites can strengthen this dismissive, cold type of contempt where you just shrug off other people's concerns and don't worry about them. And the reason speech among the elites contributes to this phenomenon is because oftentimes you need some psychologically satisfying way of dismissing those people who have their concerns. You don't want to feel like you're ignoring the poor or ignoring people who have a grievance where you have the power to address that grievance. So you need something quick that can be the dismissive thing. And sometimes it's, oh, those people are overreacting, those people are too young to understand, those people are too old to understand. There are these quick ways of dismissing that are actually contemptuous because they feed the cold type of contempt that gets spread among people with power. And so the speech among people with power actually does rile up contempt in the same way the speech among the general populace riles up a more hot version of contempt. It's just a different style of contempt at the top. So it doesn't look quite as much like contempt. But I would argue that it actually is. And my solution to this is that you need two different types of spaces, where one type of space is the free speech type of space. And this is where you let things be completely open and you acknowledge that means we're going to have some good ideas floating around and some ideas that are actually stoking contempt between this group and that other group, that are actually kind of dangerous because they could manifest in the behavior toward that other group in ways that are destructive. But the problem is, if you try to quiet that rising contempt and that emotion, you also end up shutting out the truth, the parts of the truth that have to rise to the surface in a discourse that's part of good governance. Because, of course, the discourse, the conversation is part of governance. It's a foundational part of governance, and it needs space for the truth to come to light. That cannot happen without spaces of free speech. But we also need other spaces where the discourse is all about understanding across difference. It's about figuring out what part of my own group's worldview is a straw man mythology about how those people think and what's driving those people. And that kind of space, the space where we're trying to understand and we're trying to break down the parts of our own thinking that are dismissive or unfair or just mischaracterizing. And right now we don't have this second space. We do not have spaces where those different social norms are well cultivated. And this, of course, is an institutional solution. We need institutions to do this second thing, where an institution is a set of rules, roles, norms, and enforcement mechanisms within a particular community. And these institutions can bubble up from the bottom. They don't have to come from top down being dictated. Because without such institutions, fear of something like the French Revolution might have some legitimacy. If you liked this video, you might like my video on the way money can bend the moral frame of different communities. Because I talk about anti-free speech legislation in that video and the way it's sometimes driven by interests you would not expect, by interests that are not necessarily grounded in anti-free speech values, but rather just communities protecting their own moral frame and needing anti-free speech legislation to accomplish that.